Hello, if you were listening to Newscast, the podcast on BBC Sounds on Wednesday, you would have heard us talking about the evidence that was given to the COVID inquiry by Helen McNamara, who was the Deputy Cabinet Secretary at the start of the pandemic, so a really senior civil servant. What happened after she'd given evidence and after we'd recorded the episode is that the inquiry published on the website her full witness statement, which was more than 100 pages long. So over my coffee this morning, I decided to have a read of it to see if there was any kind of extra clues in there. But for me, the real kicker was the last paragraph, paragraph 198. And I'm going to read it now because I think it sort of sums up what this whole inquiry is like. And she said, preparing this statement has taken significant effort, not least because some of the time in question was traumatic. But I'm glad to have had the opportunity to go back to try and understand better what happened and what might be learnt for the future. We can govern our country better. And I just thought that was a very powerful statement that kind of sums up what this whole inquiry has been about, because we've heard some really big stuff this week and we're going to chew over what some of it means on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio, and shortly I'll be joined by Chris Mason, who will be speaking to us virtually, appropriately, from the Artificial Intelligence Summit at Bletchley Park. The other big story this week, though, has been the quite eye-popping testimony at the public inquiry into how the government handled various phases of the COVID epidemic. And I mean, it has massively taken me back to those scary, uncertain days in kind of early spring 2020. And I spent a lot of those days sat in this very studio, and the person sat across from me and being very reassuring at all times was Laura Kay, who's back.
Hello.
Although not in the studio.
No, I'm not, but I'm logistically distanced today, not socially distanced. And I'm very pleased to hear that I was reassuring back in those scary days of March 2020.
You were one of the only people I saw.
Well, I'm pleased. Well, it was very nice. We were a tiny little band of people, weren't we, carrying on trying to do our jobs as everybody wondered what on earth was going on. And it's been a very strange experience watching this, hasn't it, this week, this inquiry proceed.
Because I was going to ask you. I mean, about your various jobs over the years. So you kind of did like the first draft of all of this as a political editor. Then you made all these documentaries and you did podcasts, and they're all on iPlayer. And that's kind of like the second draft. What's it been like watching like the latest draft unfold?
I think this week has been a really important one. And I'm sure particularly for the families of those who lost people in the pandemic, it must have been very painful. And the one comment sticks in my mind this week from one of them who said it was even worse in government than we had feared from the outside. I think what, for me, none of the testimony has been classically surprising. However, the act of hearing all of this pretty disturbing stuff actually being read into the public record is something that has real gravity and real meaning. And it's made me think also about the different phases of this as we sort of discovered over time actually just how much government was struggling, perhaps even imploding with the pressures of the pandemic. That early phase really of such national emergency when there was real political unity, real sense of unity in the country. But don't forget, just a couple of months in, there was, Dominic Cummings' trip to Barnard Castle blew out into the open. And then a couple of months after that, it became really clear how terrible things were behind the famous Black Door in Downing Street. You had political division inside the Tory party as well as over between the Labour Party and the government over whether or not there was going to be a second lockdown. And then I think the year later, we began to sort of have more comprehensive accounts of how much government had struggled, through sort of 2020 and those early really chaotic moments. And 2.5 years later, then we're past the stage of, private briefings or off the record thing or somebody popping up to do an interview and to make an intervention here and there or giving evidence to MPs. This is a comprehensive account of how bad it was being given in the most formal of settings. So even if the individual bits and pieces of evidence are not surprising if you were close to it, the very act of them being read into the record like this is something that really, I think, has meaning and import and, leaves no doubt either as to how bad things really were.
And I mean, what I keep thinking is that at the time as a political journalist, I felt a bit like Pac-Man going around the maze, gobbling up bits of information one at a time and trying to kind of get a picture that way. But actually what you're getting from this is not only these people who were in the room being on the witness stand, being professionally questioned by professional question askers, the Caseys, for hours and hours and hours and hours, but they also, at the end of the day, published the witness statements. And Dominic Cummings's witness statement and Helen McNamara, the Deputy Cabinet Secretary's witness statement, is more than 100 pages. It's like reading their autobiography of a 6-month period. And that's just so detailed. And the fact that you can put the different versions together and look for the similarities and cross-reference them. And then the fact is that in the footnotes, they then refer to other emails and other documents that haven't even been published yet. It is just such a different experience from kind of like feeling your way through the maze, like eating up the crumbs of information, trying to work it out.
Yeah, and that is the point of the purpose of having a big public inquiry, right, is so that the record becomes complete. Although remember that there is some stuff, Helen McNamara said this week that the Cabinet Office wouldn't give her work phone from that time. So this isn't even complete. But you're right, compared to, us trying to find out what was going on right at the time. It's like here is an encyclopedia, a big kind of brain dump. And from that today, 2 important things. A communication between Mark Sedwill, who was the Cabinet Secretary, the most senior civil servant at the time, and Chris Wormold, who was the boss of the Department of Health at the time, discussing in the beginning of March whether or not it was the right thing to let healthy people catch the virus like chickenpox, agreeing on the 12th of March that, yes, that was part of the plan. Now, to give it its posh name, that there in black and white is confirmation that the government did think that herd immunity was part of the plan at the beginning. Of course, we know just days later that all got torn up and they completely changed approach. But there we have now formally in the record in black and white from those 2 senior people, that was the plan that was being discussed. We also had today Chris Wormold saying on the record, now in his view, the first lockdown was a week too late. And remember, Adam, just how vigorous and fierce and stressful the debates about herd immunity and the debates about whether or not the lockdown was too late were for months and months and months and months and months on end. And now we've got people who are right in the heart of it, confirming in this way that herd immunity was something that they had as part of the plan. And also Chris Wormold now giving his view that the first lockdown was too late. And of course, people will take their own personal view as to what that really means in terms of the cost, the personal cost, and the potential lives that may have turned out differently if the government had acted earlier.
And let's hear how some of that sounded actually in the inquiry room itself.
With hindsight, we were at least a week late at all points of the MPI decisions. I agreed with the decisions at the time and the timing, but looking back, we should have done each of the things on the 12th, 16th, 23rd, if we had got to the 23rd at least a week earlier.
And I suppose, again, that's an interesting combination of stuff that seems eye-popping, but is also maybe not that surprising, because we knew that for a large chunk of the build-up to the first lockdown, the government was operating on the assumption that COVID was like flu, and basically there wasn't much you could do to stop people getting it. So what you needed to do was just like mitigate how high the peak of infections were so that the country could cope. And it wasn't till a few weeks later that various groups of people, at kind of roughly the same time in different bits of the machine, were like, well, hang on. Even if we mitigate the peak and squash the sombrero, as Boris Johnson famously said, actually there's still a chance that the NHS gets overwhelmed, and that's when the strategy shifted. And also, I think a lot of people who've been giving evidence are thinking that one of the conclusions the inquiry will reach when it finally reaches its conclusions in years to come is that the lockdown was too late. So I think maybe what we're seeing now is a sort of reverse auction of people saying, well, I realised I was the first person to realise we needed to lock down. Well, no, I was the first person to realise. I realised on Friday the 13th, but we just couldn't do it for 10 more days. And I just think that's in lots of people's minds.
Well, of course, reputation management is also always part of these things. Although what is not clear to me, which will be another interesting thing and another really important thing and part of the conversation now about it, is what were the other costs? The cost of kids' education, the cost of other bits of healthcare that fell by the wayside because everything was being, well, not everything, but so much was being focused on COVID. And I don't know if it will ever be possible, even if the inquiry has a plan, to give a kind of ledger of, well, if they'd done this, this would have happened. If they'd done this, this would have happened. And, I think that is a conversation that will be impossible to conclude, right? People are always going to have their views depending on what their own experience was. And I'm not clear the extent to which the inquiry itself is going to try to give a view in the round of the cost of the lockdown or the cost of the pause or the cost of, had they acted earlier, this wouldn't have happened or that would have happened. And that's a debate that will be very, very hard to settle.
Now, some newscasters have been getting in touch with their questions on Discord, and Discord is the place where you can sign up on the Discord app and then chat as much as you want about what we've been discussing on this podcast. And so lots of people this week have been making points and raising questions about the inquiry and about COVID. And so I thought I'd pose some of them to Laura right now. Bev said via Discord, has there been any evidence that Brexit made the COVID decision-making worse?
I think it's hard, Bev, to come up with a specific slam dunk piece of info. What is certainly true is that when the pandemic arrived, it met a government and a political party and a machine in Whitehall that was pretty battered, pretty bruised by a real period of angst and political carnage and disagreement and also genuinely difficult policy problems to solve. And I remember a former official from one of the devolved administrations saying to me, actually, in their view, Brexit had really damaged the civil service. So they were sort of walking wounded, if you like, and then suddenly roll straight into dealing with a problem that was even bigger, even harder to confront. So can you definitely say, yes, because the UK was grappling with Brexit, this particular thing didn't happen or went wrong because of that? I think it's probably hard to. But generally, did it mean that, the sort of machine was hadn't been operating at a sort of Rolls-Royce level, shall we say? Yeah, I think that probably is fair to suggest. And some witnesses have suggested that for sure.
But equally, on the flip side, some witnesses have said, all the scenario planning for no deal meant that people were like, actually, if we run out of medicines, this is what you do. Or if you can't get that, this is what you do. So
that's a great point.
Some of that was ended up being quite helpful.
And also, I should mention also just on that, some backers of Boris Johnson would also say that although the UK could have gone on its own on the vaccine, if we're in the EU, it was much more likely to go on its own having left the EU. So, the UK's huge success of the vaccine programme is not, is maybe tangentially, but probably linked to the fact that we had left the EU by that point.
And then finally, here's a real brain teaser from Jim. I'd be interested to know your thoughts generally on how government can improve the quality of leadership. How can we improve the quality of people at the top? Now, there's two different things there, Jim, isn't there? Because there's the leadership, which is actually just the act of leading and the tools and machinery you've got at your disposal if you're a leader. And then there's the kind of person that ends up being a leader. So that's kind of two different things, isn't it?
Yes. I think lots of people who have done big jobs in and around Westminster would say that the system, for want of a better word, hasn't changed enough to keep pace with how modern life is now, isn't fast enough, isn't responsive enough. I think a lot of evidence at the COVID inquiry in the last couple of weeks has backed that up. I think there's a different question, as you say, Adam, there, Jim, that how do you attract people to become politicians or to go into politics when it's a pretty tough business with huge responsibility and privilege, but also massive scrutiny, sometimes quite a poisonous environment. Yes, people are very well paid if they choose to become MPs, for example, compared to the average salary. But other very aspiring, ambitious people who think they're kind of brain boxes may well think, well, I can go and earn lots of money elsewhere. So that is you're right, Adam, there's two different debates there. One, is our government machine up to it? COVID inquiry would suggest, well, yes, could do better. And the second is, why would you want to become an MP? Jim for PM. Jim, is this a pitch?
We have to remain impartial.
Well, yes. So I'd just say Jim for PM. Yeah, I mean, who knows? Jim,
PM of another country.
Okay, well, I'll probably have a big black mark. I said, yeah.
What the thing is, though, to sound really dweeby, though, I just wonder.
You? No, never.
Surprise. All former prime ministers say they wish they'd had a bigger operation at the centre, because so often they end up having to just run the whole show, even though we actually do not have a presidential system
funny that,
where
isn't
the
it?
prime ministers. I don't think it's just power hungriness just for the sake of power hungriness. I think it is speaking from experience. But then I just wonder if actually, as a population, if the majority of people then decided, actually, yeah, we do want a prime minister that's a bit more presidential, where it's one person has more power and a less kind of parliamentary cabinet system. I just don't know if we've got a system that would ever allow that to even happen, even if actually the person at the top and the people electing the government felt the same way.
Well, we do have that system. It's about the size of the majority, isn't it? If someone gets an absolutely whopping, massive, gigantic majority, in theory, they can do all sorts of things without very much resistance. But I also think that prime ministers, and this is to be very techie about it, but as a very smart official who once explained this all to me in great detail, they said that they see it in Whitehall at the top of the machine. They see it as their responsibility to kind of get like plasticine around the prime minister of the day in order to get the best out of them. Because we don't have a written constitution. It's flexible and bendy and all the rest. Prime ministers can therefore work in the way that they wish within a set of broad parameters. But what this person also said, that they just never managed to get it right with Boris Johnson. And whether he would have been able to be a successful prime minister with a different Whitehall is entirely a matter of a completely different conversation. But it's an interesting, if thoroughly dweeby thing, that prime ministers can sort of set it up how they want, really.
And we have had quite a lot of prime ministers in quite quick succession.
We've had loads. Loads and loads and loads and loads and loads. And then, you know, I mean, I think yes.
That's
Lots.
a whole other, that could be a whole podcast series, Behind the Scenes with Laura Kuenssberg. You should think about doing that.
Well, oh God. I thought you were going to say the prime ministers. That would be the other thing. You see, you have the prime ministers. I'd love to get 4 of them in a room. Wouldn't that be good?
I'm not sure they'd all accept the invitation.
Oh, I'm sure they'd never do it, but I'm looking at 3 empty chairs. Maybe we could get 3 of them all together. I don't know.
In the Newscast studio. I mean,
Yeah,
I'd be amazed
amazing.
if they said yes.
Yeah,
but,
I
mean,
might try and get them in
the
a
door's
different-
open. The door's open.
Invite always there.
And I bet you'll get them to turn up on the Saturday edition of Newscast you'll be doing with Paddy. And I'll
Oh, I
just still
already
be
have.
sat here, Ramon.
I just didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to embarrass you.
Right, Laura, I'd love to catch up and speak to you soon.
Bye.
Now, as promised, let's talk about this week's other big story, which is coming to you from Bletchley Park, where they cracked the Enigma code in the Second World War. It is, of course, the big international summit hosted by the UK about the safety of artificial intelligence. Here's some genuine human intelligence. Chris Mason, hello.
Steady on, steady on. Hello, I am in the back of a white van with a satellite dish on the top of it and doing newscasts from here in this, as you say, quite a spot, really. The history of this place, really quite something.
And also here in the studio with me, face-to-face, the oldest tech of all is Michael Kratsios, who was the chief technology officer for the US government under President Trump and now works for a company called Scale AI. Hello.
Hello, great to be here.
Now, before we dive into this summit, I always think when we talk about AI, it's just actually very useful to get in layman's terms what bit of AI you actually do. So what does Scale AI do as a company?
Yeah, we provide infrastructure for the large model builders, so folks like OpenAI, and then we provide AI solutions for enterprises and for governments around the world.
And that's interesting because that sort of makes you realize that AI is an idea, but it's also a quite complicated concept to just deliver as a piece of technology and a thing that works in a place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ChatGPT was a big breakthrough where most people who had never interacted with AI had a chance for the first time ever to touch it, feel it, and understand what it can do. Now the next big step is how do governments and companies actually operationalize that to drive some sort of ROI or some sort of benefit.
Oh, ROI being return on investment.
Precisely.
CEO speak, love it. We should also say that this summit, it's got 2 focuses. One is the idea of safety, so not about your job being lost because it's been replaced by an algorithm, and a type of AI called frontier AI, which is basically kind of like the super cutting edge that's not even really here yet.
Correct. Yeah. So this particular event was very much focused on the risk posed by these next generation artificial intelligence models. So I would consider these low probability, high impact events that could impact the world. And for a lot of people out there, this is extraordinarily important. You know, AI could take a life of its own and do something crazy. Bad actors could potentially use some of these advanced systems to potentially create things like biological weapons. So the UK government thought it made sense to kind of bring the world together to think about these potential risks.
And so, Chris, you've had a couple of days at Bletchley Park now. So what's your take on how the summit went?
So I think, first of all, it's been pretty well attended. There was quite a bit of scepticism. I remember the Prime Minister talking to us as a political press backpack, I think when we flew back from a trip to Washington, actually, about 4 or 5 months ago. And there was a bit of scepticism about who the Prime Minister of the British government might be able to assemble around the table. Why should the UK have this kind of convening role on the world stage, was the kind of, if you like, sceptical reporter's question. And actually, when you see those who turned up here, particularly in the context of what's going on in the Middle East and elsewhere, in other words, leaders, significant political leaders who've got lots of other pressing demands on their diaries, to have the Secretary General of the UN, to have the Vice President of the United States, the President of the European Commission and others, it was quite a cast list, as well as plenty of people from the various technology companies. And then I guess what they're trying to start a potentially very long process of is trying to work out, with this huge technology with huge potential, but also huge potential risks and dangers, how you go about at a global level trying to shape some sort of basis of rules. And that, clearly is complicated and can be controversial as well, because obviously individual countries and individual companies perfectly understandably will want to sort of maximise advantages to their own, either to their own bottom line or to their own national security or whatever it might be. And the argument that the government here made was, let's start a process about how you go about thinking about those rules, with an acceptance that it'll take quite a while, probably, to get to something that can work, if it can work.
And here is how Rishi Sunak, the chair of the summit, summed it up at the end.
This partnership is based around a series of principles which set out the responsibilities we share. And it's made possible by the decision I have taken, along with Vice President Kamala Harris, for the British and American governments to establish world-leading AI safety institutes with the public sector capability to test the most advanced frontier models.
So, Michael, put that into human speak for us. Does that mean you're going to have to hand over more stuff to the British or American governments than you would have had to do last week?
Yeah, so for these large language model providers, I think what I have found so fascinating and interesting over the past year is that they themselves are very concerned about ensuring that their models are safe for the long term. And in order to do those checks, they need the help of other private sector companies and of governments to help do that testing and evaluation. So now, after this event, it seems like through these safety institutes, they will be partnering more closely with government actors to kind of help do some of this frontier testing and evaluation.
But will that make any difference then? Will that be any different from what was already happening?
Yeah, I think that the government may be a little bit more involved. I think what's very interesting and kind of an undertone that was, or a conversation that was being had at the summit yesterday when I was there, was this question about sort of open source versus closed source models. So the folks at the summit all agreed to sort of share some of the workings of their models with some of these regulators so they can do the test and evaluation. But there's an entire community around the open source development of these large language models. And what's interesting is these LLMs, if you will, or large language models, are not just sort of the 6 folks that were at the table. Take, for example, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, has a very high-performing model. The Chinese have a number of models themselves. And those are all models which, haven't agreed to share their model weights with the UK or the US. So as this thing progresses over the years, there's a lot of players out there who are not at the table today that are also developing them.
Oh, so the next alternative to ChatGPT, the thing that grabs the entire world's imagination, might come from Dubai. And the British government and the American government, however huge and snazzy their institutes are, will have no idea how it works and how dangerous it could be, and have no way to stop it.
You never know, yeah. So hopefully we can create some sort of testing and evaluation sort of standards or methodology that wherever you are in the world, you can try to run those tests against any model globally. But what has sort of been proven over the last 8 or 9 months is that this technology is really just dependent on you having enough money to buy chips to do the compute necessary to train your model.
Michael, I'm going to be really, really honest with you. So I'm a political reporter and I spend my time reporting politics. And I can't remember a time where I found myself at a summit and only ever been a word or two away from realising I haven't got the faintest idea what I'm talking about, because AI is so big and so kind of complicated to the layperson. Give me some sense from your perspective of just how revolutionary you think artificial intelligence might be over the next kind of generation, in terms of just how much it might change, well, I guess potentially everything.
I think it has a huge opportunity to change some of the most important industries that we as humans interact with. To me, I think what I'm most excited about is the opportunities that AI has in the world of healthcare and the way that we can use and actually start developing techniques around precision medicine to kind of allow more tailored solutions to individual people.
Give us a real example of what that might look like.
So right now, if you were tempted to, if you come in to do some sort of analysis and see, you're not feeling well, whatever it may be, what you'll be able to do is essentially be able to draw blood, and through that particular analysis, you can have a much more precise answer to the type of ailment that you may have versus what you have today. And I think the amount of dosage, for example, for a particular medicine that you are required, right now there's sort of standard doses based on maybe your age or your weight. You'll be able to get those much more fine-tuned to you in particular is an example. To me, I think, politically, as you guys are political reporters, I think what's sort of been fascinating around this week is there's sort of been this interest from very high levels of the U.S. government, the British government, many others, around what I would consider a bit of a niche topic within the AI debate, which is this frontier risk. So we spent essentially 2 days talking about whether or not these models will, have some sort of catastrophic risk potential in the years ahead.
That whole thing of we were hearing last week that you get an AI model to collect loads of postage stamps, and it decides the best way of doing that is by eliminating human beings, to use an extreme example. That stuff.
Precisely. And as I used to be in some sense a regulator myself, or in politics and policy. And while I think it's important for government to be thinking about those issues, I think it's equally, or if not more important, to be thinking about the here and now.
Just on a real practical level, and this isn't about geopolitics or regulation, but I was at a fringe event from this conference, so not being a VIP with a nice lanyard to get into Bletchley Park, but that's fine. And they were talking there about, obviously with these large language models, which we've been talking about, you have to train them on the data, and they basically scrape the internet for lots of examples of what they're looking at. And one of the things they were talking about here was facial recognition. Obviously, the internet is awash with pictures of white men, because throughout history, they're the people that have had their picture taken the most. How does your company or your clients make sure that they get enough pictures of, I don't know, black women, so that their algorithm of recognizing people's faces reflects the world as it is?
Absolutely. So whenever you do testing and evaluation on these models to ensure that the data that's used to train them is representative of what you ultimately want to do with the model. And what's interesting about these large language models, it's really a two-step process to make the LLM. The first step is, as you said, go out, scrape the internet for the totality of human knowledge and sort of cram it into a model. The second step is something called reinforcement learning with human feedback. And what that means is you essentially inject into the model expert-created data. So humans themselves create data or the best answers on very tough niche problems that the model isn't performing well on.
Right.
And the combination of human-generated data plus the internet is able to create a better model which answers these questions more correctly.
And Chris, I don't know about you, but when I hear that is a kind of a bingo moment for me, because you're like, oh, actually, how smart are these systems if actually they're based on lots of people sat there telling them what to think in the first place?
Yeah, and I suppose it's that old saying, isn't it, about kind of rubbish in, rubbish out.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Precisely.
We've got an American guest.
Is that what it was? I was anglicising it a bit. Yeah, good point.
Well, that's what we tell all of our customers, whether you're in the government or whether you're an enterprise. You have to have high quality data before you can have high quality AI.
And on the next episode of Newscast, we'll be able to talk about the real denouement of this summit, which is Rishi Sunak doing a Q&A with Elon Musk, the most unpredictable tech bro that there is. So I wonder what will emerge from that. Chris, hope you've had fun at Bletchley Park.
Yeah, all been good. Talk to you soon.
And Michael, thanks for coming into our very old tech studio.
Thank you so much.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. We will be back with another one very soon. Bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.